there are a couple of referendums on Second Amendment issues on the ballot this November. There's a good amendment in Iowa, and there's a very, very bad voter referendum in Oregon. And I'm very curious to see, how those play out. Like if there is a red wave, if Republicans overperform, right now there's this weird three-way race in Oregon for governor.
Yeah.
And the Republican Christine Drazan has I think the Real Clear Politics polling average is like a 2-point lead, because you've got this Democrat turned independent who's also pretty pro-gun. She's talked about a couple of things like raising the age to purchase from 18 to 21. But generally speaking, Betsy Johnson, I think at one point had an NRA rating when she was in the state legislature. So there's this fascinating race for governor. And then you've got this ballot referendum that would establish like a permit to purchase with mandatory training. It would establish basically a database of gun owners. There's a magazine ban component to it. And it's, by the way, like according to the state's own fiscal analysis, it's going to generate something like, $20 million in revenue, and it's going to cost like $50 million to implement. So, the sheriffs have come out against it. Many sheriffs have. I'm really curious to see what happens there. This is a state where you would think a gun control referendum would do pretty well. The one poll that I've seen had 51% support for it. So
that's not great.
No, it's not for Oregon.
Yeah, especially given the disconnect, as you alluded to earlier in the show, and we've talked about before, between polling and referendum votes on gun control measures. I think, the referendums will be really interesting to watch, just like they were in 2016 with the universal background check referendums, because, what a poll tells you and what the ultimate poll that really matters tells you can often be two very different things. Because as you talked about in there earlier, there's this sort of idea of, soft support for gun control. If you get asked about it on a survey, in broad terms, there's probably a lot of people who might be agreeable to all sorts of ideas as a potential solution to gun violence, which nobody wants and likes. And so, but when it comes down to here's a specific proposal that you got to go and vote on, does it translate as well? I mean, there's, in addition to the John Lott survey that you mentioned, there's also 97%, which is this new sort of more moderate gun control group, or whatever you want to call them. They did a similar survey where they asked, where one of the conclusions from it, and it's much broader than just this, but one of the conclusions was like, sure, gun owners will say that they support these certain proposals when asked generally, but they often have a lot of reservations about the more specific details of those types of proposals. And you start to lose a lot of support as you get more into those details.
Right. And those details, look, they generally don't come up in a survey, but they are going to come up in a ballot initiative, in a ballot campaign. So, I think that's I'm interested to see what happens. Iowa's referendum is also kind of interesting just because of the quirk of how it's written. So we've seen a lot of these state constitutional amendments protecting the right to keep and bear arms. Iowa's was supposed to be on the ballot, I think it was 2 years ago, but there was some there was some procedural error in the legislature. So they had to go back and restart the process all over again. And so the language of this ballot initiative says that the right of the people, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed and shall be interpreted, by the courts with strict scrutiny in mind. They use the term strict scrutiny explicitly, which is interesting because the Supreme Court has said,
rejected that.
We're not using tiered scrutiny, right? We're using history, text, tradition. That's the test.
Right.
So it's this.
Although strict scrutiny might actually result in more laws being struck down than, of course, that's an open debate, but
right.
Generally accepted, that would be even more gun control laws would be, or gun laws would be struck down under strict scrutiny.
That is the debate. And, I guess, I don't know if we could, we'll see. It seems like there's an awful lot of gun laws that are getting put on hold right now, but
that is an interesting one to put on the ballot, though, how judges should interpret the Second Amendment is not usually a referendum question. You know what I mean?
Right. No, you're right. I think there might be 2 other states that have similar language in place, but I think, and again, the intent was for, 15 years after Heller, these lower courts were using intermediate scrutiny and just upholding everything. And, this was the way to get around that, to say, no, stop doing that. This is a fundamental right, treat it as such. And I suspect that it's going to pass. I'm curious to see how big the margin is going to be. There doesn't appear to have been a whole lot of spending against this ballot measure, and I'm not aware of any state referendum to either, put a right to keep and bear arms in the state constitution or to update that right to make it more explicitly clear. I'm not aware of any of those measures ever failing. Are you? I'm trying to think about it, 'cause there have been a few over the past 10 or 15 years, but they've all passed with like 65 to 80% of the vote.
Yeah. I'm not aware of any failing either, but most states already have a provision similar to the Second Amendment in their state constitutions, so it's not a super common modern thing to see, obviously. But that is an interesting twist on it, where you're sort of amending it to also lay out the judicial test for any gun laws in the state. So. It will be interesting to see how that fares at the polls, and then how it actually gets implemented in practice as well, especially given that it now would conflict with the Supreme Court's new standard.